Have you ever played Austria in Victoria 2 or 3, formed a super Germany, and then dominated the world? Well, this dead HOI4 mod is exactly that, but taken to the extreme. The Austrians don't simply win the Brothers' War, they utterly annihilate all their foes in every engagement after 1866. The Hohenzollerns are exiled, the French lost all their colonies, and Eastern Europe has been turned into their satellite states with Ukraine, Belarus, Krakow. Wait, is that a Jewish Poland? Yeah, so apparently in this mod, the Germans decided to grant Congress Poland to the Jewish populations there, instead of making it a Polish client state. Well, anyway, despite such a straightforward approach to the lore, the novelty of a greater Germany and a Jewish Poland, the mod died in development. But why? In this video, I will take the core aspect that made this concept compelling, establish a new point of divergence, and end the Civil War spanning 3 different regions of this Super Germany to either greater heights, a reform into a European Union, or its subjugation by foreign powers. Without further ado, let's get started. I believe that the reason why this mod died in development is because of their Austria wins every time until 1936 rule. This sort of setup can work, but in my experience, this approach can make more problems than it solves. As the more times the lore goes against historical plausibility for the sake of the scenario, the less and less solid its foundation in history is. You start to invent lore without historical basis to accommodate, which gets extremely difficult to manage, until eventually nobody has the time or energy to commit anymore, let alone read your lore document that makes sure anything you add or suggest doesn't impact the canon. But how do you find the balance between historical plausibility and an interesting geopolitical scenario? In other terms, a Hearts of Iron 4 mod worth playing. My approach is simple. You take one point of divergence and move forward from there, changing as little history as possible to obtain the end result that you want. It takes a lot more work up front, but once you do, everything falls into place. So, Lux Germania's point of divergence is that the Austrians won the Brothers' War, but I would argue this is their first mistake. By making this the point of divergence, the only way to have them win is to make them win, despite the historical plausibility, leaving nothing to work with historically. Therefore, before we move forward, we need a far better point of divergence. A point of divergence should be a decision that someone makes, like invading Poland during the Soviet-Polish War instead of not doing so, the British surrendering after Dunkirk, or the Americans allowing Austria to unite with Germany in 1919. By making the point of divergence be something that leads to a result that we want, we can allow for the rest of history to only be adjusted slightly, letting us rely on real history until the butterfly effect naturally allows us to go off the rails and make something unique. So instead of their original point of divergence being that the Austrians win due to technological advances and many other deus ex machinas, we will have the Austrians managing to gain an ally rather than being diplomatically isolated like they were in our history. Historically, Austria had once been close to Russia. The Russians helped the Austrians crush their Hungarian Revolution, but the Austrians refused to return the favor by staying neutral in the Crimean War. Austria then failed to ally with France, clashing with Napoleon III over disputes in Italy. Left isolated, Austria lost to Prussia, who then went on to unify Germany without them. In this timeline, we will have Austria managing to gain an alliance with France. Napoleon III was obsessed with reviving France's imperial legacy, seeking to annex Belgium and the Rhineland into France to restore its natural borders. He once had tried to negotiate with Prussia for these ambitions, but Prussia snubbed them by exposing their plans. My point of divergence will be that once Austria hears of these ambitions, they cut a deal with the French. Austria would agree to grant France influence over the Rhineland as a client state within the German Confederation, in the event of a war with Prussia. While not an overt annexation, the political victory of getting influence over the territory would be enough to convince Napoleon III, and thus the Franco-Austrian alliance would be born. With French help, Austria defeats Prussia, France gains its imperial prize, Prussia is humiliated, Bismarck resigns, and the German Confederation survives, now clearly under Habsburg control. While in Lux Germania's timeline, Austria would then turn on France to squarely unify Germany under its rule, I'm going to keep Austria as the leader of the Confederation rather than pursuing any sort of unification efforts. This is because Austria had historically been against unification. The opportunity to become the uncontested rulers of Germany will soon come, but only after a political revolution causes the Hohenzollerns and Habsburgs to consolidate the federation. But before this point, Austria would still fear that the Prussians would turn on them if given the chance. Therefore, Austria would need to appease France to keep them as allies for as long as possible. In that regard, the Austrians and the French would collaborate on how to divide up influence in Italy. By this point, Italy had nearly unified, except for Venice and Rome. In our history, Italy seized Rome after France lost the Franco-Prussian War. Instead, France and Austria, now allies, turn on the newborn Italian kingdom. Austria reclaims Lombardy, France pushes into Piedmont using their imperial claims, the Papal States and the two Sicilies are restored, and the rest of Italy is reduced back to city-states and duchies, with spheres of influence between France and Austria. But now, the scope of the Franco-Austrian collaboration has been reached. Their geopolitical aims of preserving or restoring their empires has led to the former allies to become rivals. To secure their hold over Germany, Austria starts pushing for reforms in the German Confederation, integrating smaller states and coordinating their militaries. Many agree, but Prussia and the Rhineland resist. Prussia wants to remain independent, while the Rhineland leans even closer to France. While Austria would once again be diplomatically isolated, Napoleon III's continued reign over France would cause Britain to fear their intentions, especially as the chaotic scramble for Africa begins. Without Bismarck, and without a strong, unified Germany to host the Berlin Conference, an incident like Fashoda, where British and French expeditions had fought to secure their colonial claims, would trigger a diplomatic revolution, causing Britain to align with Austria. With France being surrounded, they would reach out to Russia, a historical rival of Britain, in order to keep the balance of power. However, it would not be enough to stop World War I from beginning. The World War would begin as disputes between France and Austria reach a point of no return. Due to the Habsburgs' pressure to integrate the Rhineland further into the German Confederation, the French Empire puts pressure on their kinsmen to repress pan-German sentiments, leading to a perfect parallel of our history. Much like how in our timeline, Franz Ferdinand was shot following a royal visit, I think that an amazing way for us to have a world war happen in this history would be that Napoleon III would be shot during a visit in the Rhineland. This would cause the French Empire to march into the state, reorganizing the territory by annexing the West Bank and transforming the remaining territory into a would-be Confederation of the Rhine. Seeing as how this violates the German Confederation's sovereignty, the Austrians would declare war to oust the French from German territory. The British would join the Austrians in their defense. Once they had, Russia would join France's side, seeking to oust Britain from Central Asia and annex Slavic territory currently under Austrian control. Even with the British on the side of the Austrians, this situation is quite dire for them, especially when minority regions in the east and south would begin to revolt for their independence against the Habsburgs. What would make things the absolute worst for them is if the Prussians joined in the dogpile and fought Austria for leadership of the German Confederation again. However, I don't think they're in the position to accomplish that. Even if they did turn on Austria, France and Russia both want to keep Germany disunited, so the benefits Prussia would gain from this are substantially low. Regardless of the low potential, there would still be a significant risk. Therefore, the Austrians promised the Prussians significant territorial gains in the event of their success. Thus, the Great War would begin, with a geopolitical scenario very similar to the Sixth Coalition, but far more grand in its outcome. And while I'd love to properly map out World War I, we're already way too deep in this timeline to be able to justify a full breakdown. Instead, we're going to cut to the part we're all waiting to see: a Habsburg Großdeutschland in 1936. After the defeat of the French and the Russians, the Austrians are able to free the Rhenish away from French dominion and expand the German Confederation by integrating Alsace-Lorraine. With these liberations and utter dominance of the small statelets in Germany, the Austrians would be officially taking the mantle of the Kaiser of Germany. This would include Prussia, whom, after the warming of relations, would actually submit to the Habsburgs, but not without significant territorial gains. I believe that the old partition of Poland would be restored, but the Prussians would also gain a significant amount of territory in the Baltic as claims to their Teutonic heritage. While these acquisitions are all well and good, this Deutschland is extremely gross, in both the German and English meanings of the word. But due to the legal legacy of the German Confederation and the non-German Habsburg titles demanding autonomy, the German Empire would not be nearly as consolidated as it's currently depicted. The kingdoms of Galicia-Lodomeria, Hungary, and Lombardy-Venetia would all become separate administrative regions, and therefore separate nations in Hearts of Iron 4. But despite being a de jure part of the German Empire, both the minor German states and Prussia would be separate tags as well, albeit integrated puppets, to showcase the differences between the viceroyalties and the core German regions. While this map may be unsatisfying to look at, it would be vital in order for my take on Lux Germania's gameplay to work. That being, the German Empire should face a significant civil war, one in which the entire world's gameplay revolves around. But the question is, how would we trigger this civil war? The easiest way to get our civil war would be that the current ruling emperor, Rudolf, dies, bringing a succession crisis within the German Empire. If this sounds familiar to you, it's because I may have talked about something like this in the Aftershocks of the Revolutions Redux video I made on the German Empire. If you're interested to see another take of this idea of a succession crisis in Habsburg Germany, check out Aftershocks of the Revolutions Redux. The link to my video on it will be in the top right. But anyway, back to Lux Germania. Archduke Franz Ferdinand's son, Rudolf, had passed away with only one daughter, Elizabeth Marie. She was extremely controversial, as she was a dedicated socialist who had sought to distance herself from the aristocracy. In this timeline, whether her father died by external or personal forces, she would become Kaiserin. This would be unacceptable for essentially all of the ruling aristocracy, so a coup would be performed in the Viceroyalty of Hungary that seeks to install an alternate claimant, Charles, onto the throne instead. This would result in a civil war which would trigger between the Habsburg crown lands and the viceroyalties, and would become the first domino towards each other region of Germania collapsing into their own local conflicts between revolutionary nationalists, separatists, and foreign interventions into core German territory, all local to their own regions in the vast German Empire. But to keep things manageable, we'll focus on one region at a time, starting with the Habsburg crown lands and the Balkans. What may initially seem like a simple fight between two different claimants to the crown becomes far more nuanced when you observe the ideologies and the motivations of the claimants. Charles represents the old order reactionary nobility who seek to keep their stratocratic society. Meanwhile, Elizabeth Marie would be supported by moderate Democrats of all colors as the legitimate claimant to the throne. But more than this, her sympathies towards socialism in our history may lead to Elizabeth enabling a revolution from above, where, after she consolidates her power over Germania, she'd then promptly abdicate, granting independence to nations formerly oppressed by German dominance, and establish a new cooperative relationship, being the foundation for a European Union-style model to be adopted across the entire continent, rather than just the boundaries of the former German Empire. The weakness of the German Empire would embolden the nations of the Balkans to invade the ascendant Bulgarians, who would be extremely vulnerable without their primary protector. In the likely event of their demise, the Serbians or Romanians may soon turn on the Habsburgs, but would await their opportunity for other nations to challenge the German order beforehand. The collapse of Hungary to civil war would instigate the Croatians under the Kingdom of Hungary to defect to Marie, who would recognize their status as a new viceroyalty. Such defection could allow for the Croatian viceroyalty to become the basis of a Marie-aligned Yugoslavia, but we're getting a little ahead of ourselves. For now, we must look north of the Carpathian Mountains and into the Viceroyalty of Galicia-Lodomeria. While the Croatians and the Bohemians may be willing to trust Marie with her promises of freedom, the Polish have been humiliated far too long to enable any of Marie's collaborators to rise to prominence in their viceroyalty, but would also never recognize Charles' claim. Instead, Polish Republicans would seize Krakow and declare their independence. Despite their act of defiance, Marie would still recognize the Polish Republic, but by doing so, she would actively antagonize the Prussians, who occupy a significant amount of territory that the Polish Republic would claim. This would lead the Prussians to recognize Charles' claim to the empire, bringing them into conflict with the northwestern German states, who would recognize Marie. With Charles' blessing, the Hohenzollerns may seek to annex these territories into their realm, but as they do, rebellions begin in the rest of their empire. The Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia all revolt, seeking recognition from Marie, and the Polish Republic invades Prussia from the east, potentially destroying the state. In the event that the coalitions of separatists and other Marie-aligned loyalists win, the Prussian state could be reorganized into a republic that recognizes Marie's government. Or they just give the crown to Marie. That might be the easiest solution. But besides the specifics of how a Marie-dominated Northeast would look like, we need to talk about the West, where the most important conflicts would be happening in this civil war. Frankfurt was the city that the German Confederation had organized itself in. Despite the main fighting of the Kaisers in the Habsburg crownland, the political significance of the city would give any potential national claimant extreme legitimacy. It is for this reason that these territories could see the largest amount of fighting, especially in the industrial regions within the influence of the French communists. As the situation became more and more untenable, Marie's announcement of her intention to peacefully dissolve the institution of the monarchy would diminish socialist radicalism, but embolden conservatives to side with Charles and rally behind the Bavarian monarchy. Thus, a Bavarian tag would revolt from this Western Germany tag, challenging the Frankfurt government and aligning with Charles. Another interesting circumstance is that the Rhineland would be cooed by a Napoleonic claimant. The French communists would then promptly invade this Napoleonic claimant, with the extremely likely outcome that the French communists win and install a puppet German government in the Rhineland. This situation would be extremely unacceptable, and essentially a repeat of the conflict that caused Germany to unite after World War I. But given how chaotic Germany would have become following the succession crisis, France would be able to easily entrench themselves in the region and consolidate their forces for an eventual Second Great War, where they would invade to spread communism to the entirety of the German Empire, and soon after, the world. But invading through the Rhineland would not be enough. They would need to strike the soft underbelly of Europe, and they would do so by capitalizing on the tenuous situation in Italy. Our lore has the French and Austrians splitting Italy between each other, later fighting in a great war and having the Austrians ultimately successful. This means that the French sphere of influence in the region, the annexation of Piedmont, the protectorate of Sardinia, and the Papal States, would then fall to the Central Powers. The result would be an Italian confederation, modeled after the German one, but with far less independence, as the Austrian king would be the leader of Lombardy Venice, who would lead the Italian Confederation, making unification of the Confederation impossible without a significant political upheaval. Once the Germans fall to civil war, a French-sponsored communist coup would expel the Savoyards to Sardinia, which would have ambitions to unite the entire peninsula under their rule. Lombardy Venice would have fallen to its own Republican revolution, and like the Polish Republic, would have been supported by Maria and her sphere of influence. Charles would refuse to acknowledge their independence and would press his claim to the state. The Piedmontese Socialist Republic would engage with the local city-states, but not engage the Italian Republic, as to avoid war escalating with Marie. The exiled Savoyards would have been on Maria's side at the beginning, but once she recognized the Italian Republic, they would look for other benefactors, but they wouldn't find it in Charles's faction, as he would still claim Lombardy Venetia for himself, and the Savoyards may have pan-Italian ambitions. They would be in contrast to the two Sicilies, who would support Charles's claim to Lombardy Venice, but seek to become the leader of the Italian Confederation in exchange. The fate of Italy would only be decided once the French are brave enough to get involved in the German Civil War. But as we move our focus away from Germany, the outcome of the world is a lot more difficult to determine. Instead, I want to focus on the potential outcomes of the dynamics that I've established thus far. While our outline for the factions seems pretty chaotic, with 3 different regions to resolve, we only have 2 national claimants, the Democrats and moderate socialists under Marie, and the conservatives and Austro-fascists of Charles. Those loyal to Marie or Charles in each region could, after their region's outcome has been determined, turn to the other regions to intervene in favor of their national claimant. A good example would be that if Bavaria manages to capitulate the Marie loyalists in Frankfurt, they could then get involved in the northeast and support the Prussians, or get involved in the southeast, putting Maria into a 2-front war. Once all regions had their preferred candidate winning, a peaceful unification could take place, where each separate tag is brought into one large Germany tag, ready to turn against those who attempted to gain from their disorder. In the case of Charles, a fully united Germania mainland, the viceroyalty system reasserted, would take place, but the system could be significantly expanded. Following the Habsburg model of AEIOU, Charles could claim the Kingdom of Italy for himself, using the Lombardian viceroyalty as a means to assert the claim. With all of Germany and Italy under his control, he may be so bold as to reclaim the Holy Roman Empire. At which point, he could claim the kingdoms of France, Spain, and Portugal for himself as well, because why not? The King of Bavaria, a loyal vassal of his, also has a claim to the United Kingdom. So perhaps he could be installed there if the Germanian Empire makes landfall. In the case of Marie, she could make good on her promise, turning every loyal viceroyalty into a republic that collaborates in a form of the European Union, which would allow for Marie to have the same sort of expansion of influence as Charles, but with far more likeliness of a peaceful integration and support from local populations. Or she could do the unthinkable, postponing or breaking her promise, consolidating Germany into an unholy monarcho-communist state. In either of the two imperial claimants' success, the French would have still encroached into German land, and if the French hadn't taken the opportunity to invade Germany already, the Germans would demand their land back. Once the French inevitably refuse, the Second World War would begin. Having such a dynamic civil war with the simultaneously railroaded World War II experience makes things especially tricky to balance, as if the civil wars in Germany go on too long, the potential communist invasion of France of the German Empire would be extremely easy to accomplish if the rival factions had already exhausted their equipment and manpower fighting against each other. But this concept is larger than just France versus Germany. So instead of viewing the German Empire as the primary character in the scenario that lives and dies with its victory and defeat, the German Civil War should be used as a catalyst for other conflicts across the world. The natural enemy of France would be Britain, whose naval dominance and spheres of influence in Italy would lead to them hosting a government in exile in Sardinia. If Maria had fallen to Charles's coup, then Maria herself could become an exile in Britain, making sure that even if Charles and Britain defeat France, that there's a potential conflict between Britain and Germany. But on top of all this depth, there's also the fact that Britain would have enemies across the world, such as Japan, who may have ambitions against their colonies. Russia itself could also be an enemy of Britain, which would significantly impact the way that their conflicts in Eastern Europe resolve. But who would lead Russia? How would that impact their foreign policy? And what would an Eastern invasion of the German Empire's sphere of influence even look like? Well, unfortunately, we're out of time to explore this further. If you want me to continue with my concept like I did with the Krasnach series, let's get this video to 3,000 likes. Once we do, I'll make a part 2 where we'll expand on the outcome of Europe. Thank you very much to my channel members for your support. Look both ways when you cross the street, and I hope you have a good day.